The rain falls in a steady rhythm across the dark water surface, each drop creating expanding circles that overlap and disappear into the blackness. If you close your eyes and listen, really listen, you can hear the percussion of it through the cypress trees, tapping against broad leaves and Spanish moss that hangs like funeral shrouds in the humid Louisiana air. Beneath that rain, there are other sounds. The guttural bellow of an alligator somewhere in the distance, the splash of something substantial moving through shallow water, the chirp and buzz of insects that never seem to sleep. And then, just at the edge of hearing, something else. Something that doesn't quite fit the natural symphony of Honey Island Swamp at night. Millions of people around the world fall asleep to recordings of this place. They download apps promising relaxation, nature sounds, the tranquility of rain, and wildlife in a primordial wetland. What they don't know, what they can't know as they drift into unconsciousness, is that some of those recordings might contain something more than frogs and rainfall. Because Honey Island's swamp holds a secret that local hunters and fishermen have whispered about for generations. A secret that walks upright through water that should slow any creature down. A secret with yellow eyes that reflect light like amber jewels in the darkness. They call it the Honey Island Swamp Monster, and its legend presents us with a disturbing question. What if the sounds that calm us, that lull us into our most vulnerable state, also mask the presence of something ancient and aware, something watching from just beyond the firelight? What if comfort and terror are not opposites at all, but two faces of the same dark coin? 1. Deep in the southeastern corner of Louisiana, where the Pearl River draws a wandering line between two states, there exists a wilderness so dense and forbidding that even today, in an age of satellite mapping and drone surveillance, large portions remain unexplored. This is Honey Island Swamp, a sprawling 70,000-acre maze of cypress and tupelo, black water and floating vegetation, where the boundary between solid ground and liquid dissolves into something neither land nor water, but some primordial combination of both. The swamp earned its name not from sweetness but from the honeybees that once swarmed to an island deep within its interior, building hives in the hollow hearts of ancient trees. But the locals know it by another reputation entirely, as the home of something far stranger than any insect colony. The water here runs the color of strong tea, stained by centuries of decaying vegetation, and in certain lights it reflects the canopy above with such perfect clarity that the surface seems to vanish altogether, creating the disorienting impression of trees growing downward into infinite depths. Spanish moss hangs in gray curtains from every branch, swaying in air so thick with humidity that breathing feels like drinking. The swamp exists in a perpetual state of half-light, the dense canopy filtering sunlight into scattered beams that shift and dance across the water like living things. This is not the kind of wilderness that invites exploration. It is the kind that swallows those who venture too far, turning them around until north and south lose all meaning, until the only direction that matters is the one that might lead back to dry land. For the Choctaw and Huma people who lived alongside this wetland for thousands of years before European contact, the swamp was never empty wilderness. Their oral traditions spoke of a guardian spirit, a creature that walked on two legs like a man, but stood taller than any human, covered in matted hair the color of river mud. The elders warned their children not to venture into the deepest parts of the swamp, where the creature made its home, protecting the sacred heart of the wetland from those who would desecrate it. This being was not necessarily evil in their telling, but it was territorial, fiercely defensive of the swamp's most hidden places. Some versions of the story suggested it was a protector spirit given physical form. Others hinted at something more ambiguous, neither wholly spiritual nor entirely animal, but something caught between worlds, as hybrid as the swamp itself. These stories might have remained footnotes in anthropological records, fragments of indigenous folklore gradually fading as the old ways gave ground to the new, except for what happened on a gray morning in 1963. That was the year Harlan Ford changed everything. Ford was not a storyteller or a believer in legends. He was a retired air traffic controller, a man whose career had been built on precision and protocol, someone more comfortable with radar screens than folklore. He had come to the swamp not seeking monsters, but searching for the wreckage of a small aircraft that had disappeared over the wetlands. He knew the area well, having spent years exploring the waterways in a flat-bottomed boat, and he approached the search with the methodical competence of someone who trusted evidence over imagination. But on that particular morning, poling through a remote channel where the water ran especially dark and the cypress knees jutted from the surface like broken teeth, Ford saw something that would haunt the remaining decades of his life. According to his account, the creature stood perhaps 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and arms that hung almost to its knees. It was covered in grayish hair matted with mud and Spanish moss, and it moved through the shallow water with surprising grace for something so large. Ford would later describe the eyes as the most unsettling feature, neither entirely human nor completely animal, but possessed of an intelligence that seemed to assess him as much as he assessed it. The encounter lasted perhaps 15 seconds before the creature turned and vanished into the palmetto thickets with barely a sound, leaving Ford alone in his boat, his hands shaking on the wooden pole. A less stubborn man might have convinced himself he had seen a bear, despite the fact that the creature walked upright, despite the proportions being all wrong, despite the way it had looked at him with what seemed like deliberate calculation. But Ford was not a man given to self-deception. He returned to the site 3 days later, this time with his friend Billy Mills, and together they discovered tracks unlike anything in the standard field guides. The prints measured roughly 11 inches long and 7 inches wide, showing 4 toes instead of the 5 you would expect from a human or bear. The stride length suggested something with legs considerably longer than a man's. Ford made plaster casts of the clearest impressions, creating physical evidence that could be examined, measured, and debated for decades to come. Those casts remain controversial to this day. Skeptics point out that the swamp's soft mud could distort any print, that the unusual toe count might result from degraded impressions rather than actual anatomy, that there is no bone, no hair, no tissue sample to conclusively prove anything beyond the fact that something made those marks. But believers counter that the consistency of the prints across multiple sites suggests a real creature, not a hoax or misidentification. They note that Ford had nothing to gain from fabricating the story. He was already retired, financially comfortable, and by all accounts more interested in birdwatching than fame. He reported what he saw because he believed it was real, and he spent the rest of his life returning to the swamp, gathering more evidence, documenting additional sightings both by himself and by others who came forward once his initial report made the news. The legend that emerged from Ford's encounter took on a life of its own, feeding on the swamp's inherent strangeness and the deep human need for wilderness to contain mysteries larger than ourselves. Reporters gave the creature a name, the Honey Island Swamp Monster, and the label stuck despite its comic book simplicity. Local guides began offering tours to the areas where sightings had been reported. People came from across the country, armed with cameras and tape recorders, hoping to catch proof of something science had overlooked. Some claimed success. Photographs emerged, usually blurry, usually taken from too far away to show definitive details. Witnesses described hearing vocalizations unlike any known animal, a kind of guttural wail that seemed to combine the shriek of a panther with something deeper and more resonant. What many of these monster hunters failed to appreciate was how the swamp itself conspired to create confusion and amplify fear. Honey Island is a place of extraordinary acoustic anomalies, where sound behaves in ways that defy common experience. The constant presence of water creates conditions for sound to travel farther and with less degradation than it would over dry land. The dense vegetation and hanging moss absorb some frequencies while reflecting others, creating strange echoes and distortions. A bird call made half a mile away can sound like it is directly overhead. The splash of an alligator sliding into the water can ricochet through the cypress columns like a gunshot. And when the rain comes, as it does with relentless frequency in this part of Louisiana, the acoustic character of the swamp transforms entirely. During the heavy rains that regularly flood the wetland, raising water levels by several feet in a matter of hours, the swamp fills with a kind of ambient roar that is both everywhere and nowhere, a white noise punctuated by drips and splashes, and the groan of trees adjusting to the rising water. In these conditions, identifying the source of any particular sound becomes nearly impossible. A person standing 50 feet away could shout and sound like they were whispering. Something moving through the underbrush could create echoes that suggest multiple creatures approaching from different directions. The swamp during a rainstorm is an environment of pure sensory confusion, where vision narrows to a few feet of gray visibility and sound becomes unreliable. It is easy to imagine how even the most level-headed observer might misinterpret what they were hearing, transforming the normal sounds of a dynamic ecosystem into something menacing and unknown. But acoustic tricks and misidentification can only explain so much. They cannot account for the consistency of the reports that continued to emerge in the decades following Ford's initial sighting. Witnesses described not just vague shapes in the distance but specific details: the same unusual gait, the same general size and build, the same grayish coloration. The tracks that were discovered at various sites shared common characteristics. And beneath it all ran the thread of those older stories, the Native American legends that had named something in the deep swamp long before Harlan Ford ever picked up a boat pole. What makes Honey Island Swamp such fertile ground for monster legends is not just its size or its impenetrability, though both factors certainly contribute. It is the way the place exists slightly outside the normal flow of time, a fragment of wilderness that has remained essentially unchanged while the world around it transformed. The same trees that sheltered Choctaw hunters still stand. The same black water flows through channels cut centuries ago. Walking into Honey Island is like stepping backward through history, into an older America where vast stretches of the continent remained unknown, where maps still contained blank spaces labeled simply as swamp or unexplored territory. In such a place, the idea that something unknown might persist feels not fantastical, but almost reasonable, as if the swamp's resistance to human control must surely shelter more than just rare birds and alligators. The monster, whether real or imagined, serves a purpose beyond simple fear or entertainment. It transforms the swamp from mere wilderness into something mythic, a landscape with its own personality and will. It gives form to the fundamental strangeness of the place, the sense every visitor feels that they are being watched, that they are tolerated but not truly welcome. And perhaps most importantly, it keeps people out. A swamp with a monster is a swamp that demands respect, that cannot be casually developed or carelessly drained. The legend becomes a form of protection, enforcing boundaries that legal designations alone might not preserve. In that sense, the creature fulfills the same role in modern folklore that it did in Choctaw tradition, serving as guardian of the swamp's deepest places, ensuring that some portion of this ancient wetland remains wild, mysterious, and gloriously unexplained. The rain hammers down on the Fook bottomlands with a violence that seems personal, as if the sky itself is trying to drown something that refuses to die. In this place where the ground never fully dries, and the cypress trees twist into shapes that look almost human in the fog, witnesses have seen something that challenges everything we think we know about what can and cannot exist in modern America. 7 feet tall. The measurement comes up again and again, spoken by people who have never met each other, recorded in police reports from different years, whispered in living rooms where the curtains stay drawn even in daylight. Not 6 feet, not 8. 7 time. Tall enough to look down at a grown man, tall enough that its eyes meet yours from a height that makes your primitive brain scream that you are prey. The witnesses describe a creature covered in gray hair, not the brown or black you might expect from bare misidentification, but a distinctive gray that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it. In the darkness of the swamp, this coloring renders the creature nearly invisible, a moving shadow among shadow. But it is the eyes that people remember most. Long after the initial shock fades, long after they have convinced themselves it must have been something else, anything else, the eyes remain burned into their memory. Amber, the color of old honey or ancient tree sap, glowing with their own internal light when caught by a flashlight beam. Not the eyeshine of a dog or deer, which is merely reflected light, but something that seems to originate from within. The eyes sit wide-spaced, in a face that witnesses struggle to describe, as if their minds refuse to process what they saw. Some say the face is ape-like but wrong, the proportions skewed in ways that create a valley of revulsion in the observer. Others cannot describe it at all, their memories fragmenting when they try to recall the details, leaving only the impression of something that should not exist. And then, there is the smell. Every witness who claims a close encounter mentions it, and the consistency of their descriptions is perhaps more unnerving than the variations. They call it the smell of death, but that phrase does not capture the full horror of it. Not the clean, clinical smell of a funeral home, or even the immediate shock of roadkill on a summer highway. This is decay and rot, mixed with something animal and alive. The stench of a predator that lives among the dying. Some witnesses describe it as wet dog mixed with spoiled meat. Others say it reminds them of a slaughterhouse crossed with swamp gas. One man, a Vietnam veteran who had smelled death in the jungle, said it was like nothing he had ever encountered. A smell that triggered nausea and panic in equal measure. The odor announces the creature before it appears, a warning that something is near, something that does not belong to the civilized world. 1974 marks a turning point in the Wookie creature narrative, the year when the monster allegedly came into focus, literally. Bobby Ford and Billy Mills claimed to have achieved what no one else had managed, capturing clear footage of the creature on film. Not the shaky, ambiguous glimpses that characterize most cryptid evidence, but sustained, detailed footage that would presumably settle the question once and for all. According to their account, they tracked the creature through the bottoms for 3 days, learning its patterns, identifying where it moved through the thickets. They set up in a location where crushed paths through the vegetation suggested regular travel, where the mud showed the distinctive tracks that had become the creature's signature. The footage they claimed to have captured would have been revolutionary. Billy Mills described it in interviews before his death, his voice carrying the frustration of a man who knows he will never be fully believed. He said the creature walked past their hiding spot at a distance of less than 30 yards, moving through a clearing in the full light of an overcast afternoon. Not a brief glimpse, but nearly 2 minutes of footage showing the creature in profile and frontal view as it paused to examine something on the ground. He described how the muscle structure moved under the gray hair, the way the arms hung longer than human proportions would allow, the strange gait that was neither quite bipedal nor quadrupedal, but something in between. But the film is gone, or hidden, or never existed at all, depending on who you ask. The official story changes depending on the source. Some say Ford and Mills sold the footage to a private collector whose identity remains unknown. Others claim government agents confiscated it, though no documentation of such a seizure has ever surfaced. Mills himself said in a 1992 interview that they hid it because they feared ridicule, feared that releasing it would bring a flood of attention to Wookie that would destroy the creature and the fragile ecosystem it inhabits. He took the location of the footage to his grave in 2003, leaving behind only his testimony and a mystery that gnaws at cryptozoologists to this day. The question hangs heavy over the entire case. If the footage was real and showed what they claimed, why not release it? If it was a hoax, why maintain the story for decades without attempting to profit from it? The lost footage of 1974 has become its own legend within the legend, a ghost haunting a ghost story. But testimony in lost films can be dismissed, rationalized away by skeptics and believers alike. Physical evidence is harder to ignore, and the Wookie creature has left its mark on the landscape in ways that demand explanation. The tracks appear after heavy rains, pressed deep into the mud of the bottoms, discovered by hunters and fishermen who were not looking for monsters. 4 toes. Not 5 like a bear, not the cloven hoof of a deer, but 4 distinct toes arranged in a pattern that matches no known animal in North America. The first detailed plaster cast was made in 1971 by a state wildlife officer responding to reports from a local farmer. The cast shows toes of unequal length, the largest being roughly 4 inches across, with what appear to be claw or nail impressions at the tips. But it is the webbing that makes the tracks truly strange. Between each toe, the cast shows clear evidence of webbing, similar to that found on aquatic birds or amphibians. This detail appears in casts made years apart by different people, a consistency that is difficult to explain if the tracks are hoaxed. The webbing suggests adaptation to the environment, to a creature that moves through the water-saturated bottomlands with ease. Witnesses have reported seeing the creature in the Sulphur River, moving through water that would be chest-deep on a man, seemingly at home in an element that would slow or stop most land animal. The 4-toed tracks have been found on sandbars in the middle of the river, in places accessible only by swimming or wading through strong currents. Whatever makes these tracks as comfortable in the water, perhaps more comfortable than on land. The crushed vegetation paths tell their own story. In multiple locations throughout the Wookie bottomlands, Researchers have documented trails through dense thickets where something large has forced its way through repeatedly, creating tunnels through vegetation that would stop a human. The paths run for hundreds of yards, connecting different areas of the swamp in a network that suggests territoriality and purpose. The vegetation is not cut or broken cleanly, as it would be if someone cleared a path with tools, but crushed and bent, forced aside by brute strength. Analysis of these paths reveals a pattern. They tend to follow the highest ground in the bottoms, the narrow ridges that stay above water even during floods. They connect food sources, leading from the river to stands of persimmon and wild grape, to areas where feral hogs root in the soil. The paths avoid human habitation, but pass close enough to suggest the creature is aware of the farms and houses, that it knows where the people are and chooses its routes accordingly. And then, there are the sounds. If the physical evidence invites debate, the sounds create something closer to dread. Witnesses describe guttural howls that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere, vocalizations that blend with the ambient noise of the swamp until you cannot separate the creature from the environment. During thunderstorms, when the rain pounds down and the thunder rolls across the water, people report hearing calls that weave between the natural sounds, using the storm as cover, as camouflage. Audio camouflage. The concept suggests intelligence, adaptation, an understanding of how to move and communicate without detection. The calls are described as starting low, almost below the threshold of hearing, a vibration you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. Then they rise in pitch and volume, becoming a howl that is neither wolf nor human, but contains elements of both. The calls cut off abruptly, leaving a silence that seems deeper than what came before. Hunters familiar with every sound the swamp produces, men who can identify a species by its call in pitch darkness, say these vocalizations match nothing in their experience. Some have attempted to record the sounds, setting up equipment in areas where the calls are most frequently reported. The recordings that exist are frustratingly ambiguous, filled with background noise that obscures detail, but those who have heard the calls in person insist the recordings do not capture the full impact. The way the sound seems to vibrate through your body and trigger a panic response that evolution hardwired into the human brain. What could survive in terrain like the Wookie bottomlands? The question is worth examining because the environment itself is hostile to human presence. The bottomlands flood regularly, transforming from land to lake and back again in cycles tied to rainfall hundreds of miles away. The water is stained dark with tannins, hiding what moves beneath the surface. Cottonmouths and alligators are common. The mud can swallow a person who steps in the wrong place. The vegetation is so dense that visibility drops to mere feet in many areas. Yet this hostile environment could also provide perfect cover for a creature that has adapted to it. A large omnivore with aquatic adaptations could find ample food in the swamp. Fish and turtles, bird eggs and small mammals, wild hogs and deer, persimmons and muscadines depending on the season. The isolation is nearly complete. Vast stretches of the bottomland see no human visitors for months at a time. A creature that learned to avoid people, that moved primarily at night or during storms when humans stay indoors, could exist in relative peace. But the unease remains. The witnesses continue to come forward, separated by years and miles, describing the same details they could not have coordinated. The tracks continue to appear. The paths through the vegetation continue to show signs of regular use. And on nights when the storms roll in from the west, when the rain falls hard enough to drown out all other sounds, people still report hearing something in the darkness that makes them lock their doors and stay away from the windows. 7 feet tall with gray hair and amber eyes that glow in the dark. 4-toed tracks with webbing between the toes. The smell of death moving through the trees. These details accumulate into something that demands explanation, even if that explanation challenges our certainty about what is and is not possible in the modern world. The rain came down in sheets across Honey Island Swamp on the night of October 12, 2006, and somewhere beneath that relentless curtain of sound, something else was moving. Local fisherman Gerald Thibodeau had pulled his boat under the skeletal remains of an old cypress when he heard it. A vocalization that seemed to ride just beneath the frequency of the falling rain. Deep and rhythmic, almost like speech, but not quite. He would later describe it to researchers as the sound of someone trying to talk underwater, resonant and deliberate, rising and falling with an intelligence that made the hair on his arms stand up despite the humid air. When he reported the incident to the Gulf Coast Bigfoot Research Organization, they asked him to return to that exact spot with recording equipment. What they captured over the following months would become some of the most analyzed and debated audio in cryptozoology. Dr. Alan Marsh, a sound engineer from Louisiana State University who specializes in environmental acoustics, first examined the Honey Island recordings in 2008. He approached the material with professional skepticism, expecting to find nothing more than misidentified animal calls distorted by weather conditions and human imagination. What he discovered instead challenged his assumptions about what existed in those wetlands. Using spectral analysis software originally designed for submarine warfare research, Marsh isolated layers of sound that human ears simply couldn't separate in real time. Beneath the white noise of rainfall, beneath the chorus of frogs and the rustle of wind through Spanish moss, there were patterns that didn't fit. The vocalizations occurred at frequencies between 80 and 300 Hz, a range that overlaps with human speech but extends lower, into territory typically associated with large primates. More disturbing than the frequency itself was the structure. These weren't random sounds. They showed modulation, repetition, and what Marsh reluctantly called intentionality. The most compelling recording came from April of 2009, during one of the heaviest spring storms in recent memory. A team of researchers had placed motion-activated audio recorders throughout a 5-mile stretch of the swamp, focusing on areas where locals reported the highest concentration of unusual activity. Camera 7, positioned near an old trapper's cabin long since reclaimed by the wetlands, captured 18 minutes of audio that would take Marsh and his colleagues over 200 hours to fully analyze. The recording begins with typical rain sounds, heavy drops hitting water and vegetation, the distant rumble of thunder. Then at the 4-minute mark, something changes. There's movement through water, distinct splashing that suggests something large wading through the shallows. The gait pattern is bipedal, 2 steps then pause, 2 steps then pause, methodical and purposeful. Then comes the vocalization, a series of low whooping calls that rise into what can only be described as a scream, primal and aggressive, cutting through the rain like a knife. Marsh applied filtering techniques to strip away the rain interference, a process he compared to removing layers of fog from a photograph. What emerged was clear enough to make him reconsider everything he thought he knew about the swamp's inhabitants. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to be using the rain as acoustic camouflage. During breaks in the precipitation, the vocalizations would cease entirely. When the rain intensified, the sounds would resume, sometimes growing bolder, closer to the recording device. This suggested an awareness that most animals simply don't possess, a cognitive understanding of how sound travels and how noise can mask movement. Black bears, alligators, even the occasional Florida panther that wandered into the region, none of them demonstrated this kind of calculated behavior. The rain theory, as researchers began calling it, proposed that the Honey Island creature had adapted its hunting and territorial behaviors, specifically around weather patterns. Marie Boudreau, whose family has lived on the edges of Honey Island swamp for 6 generations, remembers her grandmother talking about the rain screams, long before researchers ever came with their equipment. According to family stories passed down through decades, the old-timers knew not to venture into the deep swamp during storms. It wasn't just the danger of flooding or lightning strikes, though those were real enough. It was the knowledge that something out there became active when the rain fell, something that used the weather to its advantage. Marie recalls childhood nights when thunderstorms would roll across the wetlands, and through the rain she would hear sounds that her mother would dismiss as wild pigs or owls, though even as a child Marie knew better. The sounds were too large, too purposeful, and they came from something that walked on 2 legs, not 4. She describes hearing heavy splashing, the kind that comes from something massive pushing through shallow water, followed by calls that made her pull the blankets over her head and pray for morning. The sensory disorientation effect that constant rain creates in the swamp cannot be overstated. Sound engineer Jennifer Cole, who spent 3 weeks in Honey Island in 2011, specifically to study acoustic conditions during storms, described the experience as psychologically destabilizing. Rain in a swamp environment doesn't sound like rain in open country or even in a forest. The water creates a base layer of noise as drops hit the standing pools and channels. The vegetation adds texture as rain strikes thousands of leaves and hanging moss. The humidity seems to compress sound, making it harder to judge distance and direction. Cole found that after just 15 minutes in heavy rain, she lost almost all ability to accurately locate the source of sounds. Something that seemed to be 50 feet away might actually be 10 feet distant or 200 yards. The constant white noise creates a phenomenon similar to sensory deprivation, where the brain begins to struggle with processing auditory information, and can even generate phantom sounds to fill the void. For a creature trying to remain hidden, this acoustic confusion represents a perfect hunting opportunity. For humans trying to navigate or understand what they're hearing, it becomes a nightmare of uncertainty. Multiple witnesses have reported hearing what they describe as bipedal movement through water during storms, that distinctive two-beat splashing pattern that doesn't match a four-legged animal's gait. Fisherman Paul LaRose encountered this firsthand in June of 2013. He'd been checking his crawfish traps, despite deteriorating weather, when the rain began in earnest. Within minutes, visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the sound of rain hitting the water surface created an almost overwhelming wash of noise. Then he heard splashing moving parallel to his boat, keeping pace with him as he pulled through a narrow channel. The pattern was unmistakable: step splash, methodical and deliberate. When he stopped moving, the splashing stopped. When he continued, it resumed. Paul made the decision to head for open water, and spent the next 2 hours running his boat in the rain, rather than risk whatever was following him in those channels. The acoustic analysis revealed something else that researchers found particularly intriguing. In several recordings, there appeared to be response patterns between multiple individuals. A vocalization from one location would be answered by a different call from several hundred yards away. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Marsh noted that the calls seemed to bracket moving objects, potentially coordinating the positions of hunters tracking prey. This suggested not just intelligence, but social complexity, organized behavior that required communication and cooperation. Some recordings captured up to 4 distinct vocalizations occurring in sequence, originating from different compass points, as if the creatures were surrounding something in the darkness and rain. The theory of rainfall as deliberate cover extends beyond just hunting. Researchers believe the creature may also use storms for territorial movement, traveling between areas of the swamp that would be too exposed in clear weather. Game cameras positioned along known pathways occasionally show evidence of large bipedal passage immediately following storm systems, trackways that appear overnight in mud softened by heavy rain. The tracks themselves rarely last long, washed away by subsequent weather or obscured by rising water levels, but their temporary presence suggests coordinated movement during specific weather windows. Local hunter Marcus Devereaux describes an encounter from August of 2015 that exemplifies the disorienting nature of storms in the swamp. He built a blind near an old logging road, planning to hunt feral hogs that had been destructive to nearby properties. An afternoon thunderstorm rolled in unexpectedly, and Marcus decided to wait it out rather than try to navigate back through the flooded terrain. The rain came down so hard that he could barely see 15 feet beyond his position. Then he heard it. Not animal sounds he recognized, but something that sounded almost like words, guttural and low, filtering through the rain from somewhere uncomfortably close. The sound circled his position over the course of maybe 20 minutes, never quite resolving into a clear direction, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When the rain finally eased enough for him to risk moving, Marcus found large impressions in the mud around his blind, partial prints that suggested something with a foot at least twice the size of his own had been examining his hiding spot, while he sat there paralyzed with uncertainty. The psychological impact of these encounters during storms creates its own layer of testimony reliability questions. Researchers acknowledge that sensory deprivation, fear response, and the inherently disorienting nature of the swamp environment can all contribute to misperception and exaggeration. However, the audio recordings provide something that witness testimony alone cannot: an objective capture of actual sound events that can be analyzed repeatedly under controlled conditions. When multiple witnesses describe hearing the same patterns, Bipedal splashing, low vocalizations, apparent intelligence in the timing and location of calls. And those descriptions match what appears on the audio analysis. The cumulative weight of evidence becomes harder to dismiss. The rain continues to fall on Honey Island Swamp, as it has for thousands of years, creating temporary channels and flooding ancient pathways, masking sound and obscuring sight. And if the research is correct, something in those waters has learned to use that rain as an ally, a cover that allows it to move and hunt and call to its kind without revealing itself to the world beyond the trees. The recordings sit in archives now, studied by skeptics and believers alike, each listening for something different in the layers of sound beneath the rain, some seeking proof and others hoping for mystery to remain mystery. But for those who live along the edges of the swamp, no analysis is needed. They know what they've heard in the darkness when the storms roll in, and they know enough to stay inside and wait for morning. Every night, millions of people around the world close their eyes and drift into sleep while listening to the sounds of one of America's most notoriously haunted locations. They don't know the stories. They've never heard the warnings. They simply search for rain sounds, find a video promising relaxation, and press play. What they're actually hearing are recordings captured deep within Honey Island Swamp, a place where locals refuse to go after dark, where legends speak of creatures that should not exist, and where something in the darkness has watched people for generations. The irony is almost perfect in its strangeness. The very sounds that emanate from a location synonymous with terror have become a digital lullaby for the stressed and sleepless masses. The phenomenon began quietly, as most digital folklore does, around 2015. Audio content creators and nature recording enthusiasts discovered that swamp ambience performed exceptionally well in the growing market of sleep and relaxation videos. The algorithm favored these sounds. Listeners reported falling asleep faster, sleeping more deeply, and experiencing what they described as profoundly restful night. Among the countless swamp recordings flooding platforms like YouTube and Spotify, those specifically captured in Honey Island Swamp rose to the top with unusual speed. Videos with titles like Deep Swamp Rain for Sleep and Louisiana Bayou Thunderstorm Ambience accumulated view counts in the tens of millions, playing on loop in bedrooms across every continent. Marcus Chen was one of the first content creators to recognize the potential. A sound engineer from Seattle with no previous connection to Louisiana, he made his first trip to Honey Island Swamp in late 2016, armed with professional-grade recording equipment and plans to capture 12 hours of continuous audio. What he expected was straightforward field recording work. What he experienced changed his entire perspective on his craft. Marcus describes arriving at the swamp's edge just before sunset, setting up his equipment in a clearing that local guides had assured him was safe, though their definition of safe came with considerable hesitation. The guides refused to stay with him overnight, despite his offer of substantial payment. They would return at dawn, they said, and made him promise to stay exactly where they left him. The first few hours of recording were unremarkable. Marcus captured clean audio of evening insects, the gentle movement of water, the calls of night birds settling into their routines. Then, around 11 at night, his equipment began behaving strangely. His digital recorder, a device he had used professionally for 8 years without issue, started registering input levels that fluctuated wildly despite no corresponding change in the actual volume of surrounding sounds. The frequency spectrum displayed on his monitoring equipment showed patterns that made no acoustic sense. Clusters of sound in ranges that biological sources shouldn't produce. Marcus checked every connection, swapped out batteries, even switched to his backup recorder. The anomalies continued. He describes the feeling that settled over him around midnight as fundamentally different from ordinary nervousness or the expected unease of being alone in an unfamiliar wilderness. This was the sensation of being observed with intention, with focus, with something approaching intelligence. The ambient temperature seemed to drop, though his thermometer showed no change. The normal sounds of the swamp became muted, as if the environment itself was holding its breath. And then he heard it through his headphones. Something that wasn't quite a voice, but wasn't quite anything else either. A low rhythmic sound that seemed to weave between the rain that had begun to fall. He describes it as almost like breathing, if breathing could have texture and weight and presence. Marcus stayed until dawn, as he had promised the guides, though he admits he spent the last few hours seriously questioning that decision. When he returned to Seattle and began processing his recordings, he found something that both disturbed and fascinated him. Beneath the rain sounds, buried in the lower frequencies, there were patterns. Not quite repeating, but structured enough that his audio analysis software flagged them as anomalous. When he isolated these sounds and ran them through various filters, they produced waveforms that resembled nothing in his extensive library of natural sound samples. Against his better judgment, but driven by the practical reality that he had invested significant money in the trip, Marcus edited the recordings into a 10-hour sleep video and uploaded it to his channel. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a week, the video had accumulated more views than anything else he'd ever produced. The comments section filled with testimonials from listeners describing the best sleep they had experienced in years. But mixed among the praise were other comments, stranger observations that Marcus found increasingly difficult to dismiss. Users reported dreams of walking through dark water, of being surrounded by trees that moved when not directly observed, of encounters with something tall and watching from just beyond their field of vision. Several people described experiencing sleep paralysis for the first time in their lives while listening to his recording, always with the sensation of something standing at the foot of their bed, something that smelled like swamp water and rot. Sarah Vega, a content creator from Austin, Texas, had a similar experience when she visited Honey Island Swamp in 2018. Unlike Marcus, Sarah had researched the location extensively before her trip. She knew the legends, had read the reports, understood the reputation. She went specifically because of the swamp's dark history, believing that authenticity in her recordings would translate to better content. She hired a local guide named James Boudreau, a third-generation swamp resident who made his living taking the occasional tourist or researcher into the deeper sections of the wetlands. James told her something during their first meeting that she initially dismissed as local superstition designed to add atmosphere for visitors. He said that the swamp remembers everyone who records its sounds, and that taking those sounds away, broadcasting them to the world, was a form of invitation. Sarah laughed politely and set up her equipment at a location James recommended with obvious reluctance, a spot deep enough to capture authentic swamp ambience, but close enough to navigable waterways that extraction in an emergency would be possible. She recorded for 3 consecutive nights, each session lasting from dusk until roughly 3 in the morning. On all 3 nights, her equipment malfunctioned in ways that seemed almost deliberate. Cameras drained fully charged batteries in under an hour. Her backup power supplies failed simultaneously. Audio cables disconnected themselves from secure inputs. On the 3rd night, her primary recorder captured what sounded like her own voice, calling her name from somewhere in the distance, despite the fact that she was alone and had not spoken. The recordings Sarah brought back generated even more dramatic results than Marcus had experienced. Her Honey Island Swamp Rain video crossed 50 million views within 6 months of posting. Listeners reported not just improved sleep, but vivid experiences that bordered on the hallucinatory. A user named Jennifer, from Ontario, described falling asleep to the recording and dreaming that she was lying in shallow water, while something moved in circles around her, just beyond her peripheral vision. When she woke, her sheets were damp, though her windows were closed and there was no explanation for the moisture. A listener from Germany reported that his bedroom began to smell like swamp water on nights when he used the recording, a smell that his partner confirmed, but that disappeared completely when the audio was turned off. The psychological paradox at the heart of this phenomenon has attracted attention from researchers studying the intersection of digital media and altered states of consciousness. Dr. Rachel Thornton, a psychologist specializing in sleep disorders and auditory processing, has analyzed several of the most popular Honey Island swamp recordings. Her findings suggest that these audio files contain layered frequencies that interact with the brain's processing of environmental sound in unusual ways. The rain sounds and natural ambience occupy the frequency ranges typically associated with white noise and proven sleep aids. But beneath those comforting layers, there are other sounds, other patterns that Dr. Thornton describes as almost designed to bypass conscious processing and speak directly to more primitive parts of the brain. She proposes that listeners are experiencing a form of binaural safety response, where the conscious mind recognizes soothing elements like rain and water, while the unconscious mind simultaneously detects signals of potential threat. This creates a neurological state similar to the hypervigilance our ancestors experienced while sleeping in dangerous environments, a state that paradoxically can lead to deeper sleep because the primitive brain believes it is standing guard. But Dr. Thornton also notes elements in the recordings that she cannot easily explain. Sonic artifacts that don't match known natural or artificial sound sources, patterns that seem to affect listener brain activity in ways that pure noise should not be able to achieve. The content creators themselves have become increasingly uneasy about their own work. Marcus Chen no longer listens to his Honey Island swamp recordings, even to check audio quality. He describes feeling as though the sounds have begun to follow him, manifesting in his daily life at unexpected moments. He hears the same breathing pattern he captured in the swamp, while falling asleep in his own bed, thousands of miles from Louisiana. Sarah Vega has experienced stranger phenomena. Objects in her home move overnight, arranging themselves in patterns that remind her of cypress tree formations. She finds puddles of water in her recording studio with no identifiable source. Most disturbing, she has begun to see a figure in her peripheral vision while editing audio. Always tall, always watching, always gone when she turns to look directly. Despite their personal experiences, both Marcus and Sarah continue to maintain their videos on public platforms. The financial incentive is part of the reason, as these recordings generate substantial advertising revenue. But both also admit to a deeper compulsion, a sense that removing the videos would be somehow worse than leaving them available. Sarah describes it as feeling like she made an agreement she doesn't remember making, and that breaking that agreement would have consequences she doesn't want to discover. Marcus simply says that the swamp wants to be heard, and he no longer feels he has the right to silence it. The listener testimonials continue to accumulate, growing stranger and more detailed with each passing month. A user in Japan reports that, after 3 months of nightly exposure to a Honey Island swamp recording, she began to understand what the sounds beneath the rain were saying. Though she cannot explain in any language, she knows what the message actually means. A listener in Brazil describes developing a compulsion to visit Louisiana, despite having no previous interest in American travel, driven by a certainty that something in the swamp is waiting specifically for him. Multiple users have reported sleep paralysis episodes featuring the same entity, described consistently as impossibly tall, covered in something between hair and moss, with eyes that reflect light like an animal's, but with an intelligence that is disturbingly human. The videos keep playing, the view counts keep climbing, and every night millions of people around the world close their eyes and invite the sounds of Honey Island swamp into their most vulnerable hours. They find comfort in audio captured from a place of darkness and legend. They sleep deeply to sounds that terrified the people who recorded them. And beneath the rain, beneath the calls of night birds and the movement of water, something else continues to broadcast its presence into bedrooms across the planet. The content creators know it's there. The researchers can measure its effects. The listeners feel it in their dreams. But the videos keep playing, because once you've heard the real sounds of Honey Island swamp, once you've let them into your sleeping mind, turning them off feels impossible. The swamp has found a way to extend its reach far beyond the boundaries of Louisiana wetlands, and it has done so with our eager cooperation, one autoplay session at a time. The rain hadn't stopped for 47 hours when the expedition team reached the coordinates that marked the furthest point Harlan Ford had documented in his field notes from 1974. Sarah Chen stood in chest-deep water, checking her GPS against the waterproof maps sealed in plastic, and realized they were about to do something no research team had attempted in the modern era. They were going deeper into Honey Island swamp during monsoon season than anyone with proper documentation equipment had ever ventured. The expedition had taken 14 months to organize. Dr. Wu Chen, a cryptozoologist from Tulane University who had spent the better part of a decade studying primate vocalizations in the Pacific Northwest, assembled a team that combined academic rigor with serious field experience. Her co-lead was Marcus Webb, a former Navy SEAL turned wildlife cinematographer who had filmed in some of the most hostile environments on Earth. Their audio engineer was a man named Thomas Keller, someone whose work capturing whale songs in the Arctic had earned him recognition from the Acoustic Society of America. The fourth member was local guide Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau, whose family had navigated these waterways for 6 generations, and who claimed his grandfather had encountered something in these swamps that he refused to speak about for the last 30 years of his life. The preparation was extraordinary in its thoroughness. They brought military-grade thermal imaging cameras, motion-activated trail cameras with cellular uplinks, and enough battery power to run their equipment continuously for 2 weeks. But it was the audio setup that represented the real investment. Keller had designed a custom array of ultrasonic microphones capable of capturing frequencies far below and above human hearing range. The main recording rig could pick up a heartbeat from 50 yards away in optimal conditions. They had directional microphones mounted on motorized gimbals that could track movement through 360 degrees. The entire system fed into redundant digital recorders with backup drives that wrote data in real time to 3 separate storage devices. The total cost of the audio equipment alone exceeded $90,000. Their hypothesis was elegant in its simplicity. If something large and undocumented lived in these swamps, monsoon season would force it to move. The rising water would flood the deepest refuges, the places where something could hide during the dry months, when boat traffic increased and hunting parties ventured further into the interior. The constant rain would also mask the sound of human presence. They theorized that whatever Harlan Ford had tracked, whatever had left those plaster casts and appeared in those grainy photographs, would be most active during the storms. The rain was their cover and their opportunity. They entered the deep swamp on a Tuesday in late September of 2019 titled, "The first night passed without incident beyond the expected discomforts." The rain was relentless, turning the air into something you could almost chew. The mosquitoes, despite the deluge, found every gap in their protective netting. The sounds of the swamp at night created a wall of noise that Keller said was actually perfect for their purposes. With proper filtering, the background ambience would make any anomalous sound stand out in sharp relief. The second day took them beyond Ford's furthest documented point. They were navigating through cypress stands so thick that GPS signals became unreliable. Thibodeau guided them using landmarks that seemed invisible to everyone else, a fallen tree with a particular curve to its trunk, a pattern of Spanish moss on a dead branch, the way the water flowed around a submerged stump. The swamp here felt different. Webb mentioned it first, during a brief pause to change batteries. He said it felt like being watched, but not the normal sensation of wildlife awareness. This was something else, something patient. Chen noticed the absence of certain sounds. In the outer swamp, they had documented 17 different bird species, constant frog calls, the splash of fish and turtles. Here, in the deep interior, there were stretches of minutes where nothing made a sound except the rain. It was Thibodeau who explained that locals had a name for these silent zones. They called them the waiting places. His grandfather had told him that animals knew where not to go, that there were territories in the swamp that belonged to something else, and everything with sense enough to survive respected those boundaries. The second night brought the first anomaly. At 2:17 in the morning, during a brief lull in the rain, Keller's motion-tracking microphone array activated. The recording captured something moving through water approximately 80 yards from their camp. The pattern was clear even on first playback. Bipedal, deliberate, pine, dal. Each step created a displacement wave that the microphones captured in extraordinary detail. Whatever was moving weighed enough to push significant water with each stride. Keller calculated, based on the wave frequency and the depth of the tone, that they were listening to something that massed at least 400 pounds, possibly much more. The movement continued for 6 minutes, paralleling their camp, then stopped. The recording captured what might have been breathing, a deep rhythmic sound that didn't match any animal in their reference database. Then silence. Then the normal swamp sounds gradually resumed, as if something had released the world from a held breath. They discussed breaking camp immediately. Webb argued they had what they came for, that 6 minutes of clear bipedal movement was more than any previous expedition had documented. But Chen insisted they continue. One recording could be questioned, analyzed away, attributed to equipment malfunction or misidentification. They needed multiple captures, they needed patterns, they needed evidence so overwhelming that dismissal became impossible. The third day took them into territory that Thibodeau admitted he had never personally explored. The The water was darker here, stained almost black by tannins. The cypress trees grew to proportions that seemed impossible, their trunks 20 feet across, their canopy creating a twilight gloom even at midday. They found evidence that humans had been here before, but not recently. A rusted chain wrapped around a tree, the metal so corroded it crumbled at touch. A glass bottle, the design dating it to perhaps the 1920s or 30s, half buried in mud. And something else that none of them photographed, though Webb's camera was running. It was a structure, if you could call it that, made of branches and debris, formed into something almost like a lean-to but massive in scale. The opening was easily 8 feet high. The interior smelled of decomposition and musk. Chen collected samples of hair caught on the rough wood, reddish-brown strands that were coarse and thick. She sealed them in evidence bags without comment, but her hands were shaking. That third night brought the thunderstorm. It arrived with a fury that seemed personal, as if the swamp itself was rejecting their presence. The wind turned the rain horizontal. Lightning struck close enough that they could smell ozone and burnt wood. Their camp, established on a small rise that Thibodeau promised was solid ground, became an island in rushing water. They had secured their equipment in waterproof cases and lashed everything to the largest trees. But the violence of the storm made all preparation feel inadequate. The event occurred at the storm's peak, when thunder was a continuous roar and the rain was so heavy that breathing required conscious effort. Keller's equipment captured everything. Later analysis would reveal that the approach began at 11:42 p.m. Something massive was moving through the camp perimeter. The audio picked up footfalls that registered on the seismograph app Chen had running on her tablet. Each step measured 0.03 on the Richter scale. The thermal cameras should have captured imagery, but every single one failed in the same moment, their lenses suddenly showing nothing but white static despite being sealed against weather and electromagnetic interference. The team huddled in their tent, listening to something circle their camp. The pattern was methodical, almost curious. Webb had a spotlight, the kind used for night hunting, capable of throwing a beam visible for half a mile. He didn't turn it on. Later he would tell investigators that some instinct, some primal understanding that lived below conscious thought, told him that revealing themselves would be a fatal mistake. The audio captured breathing, close enough that it had to be within 10 feet of their tent. The inhalation lasted 4 seconds, the exhalation 5 tartak. It repeated 17 times. Then came the vocalization. The sound started low, below the range of human hearing, but Keller's equipment captured it in full spectrum. It rose through frequencies, gaining harmonics, becoming something that felt designed to trigger every fear response evolution had written into the human nervous system. The closest comparison in the natural world would be a gorilla's roar mixed with an alligator's bellow, but deeper, more resonant, carrying an intelligence behind it that suggested language rather than animal threat display. The vocalization lasted 12 seconds. Inside the tent, Chen began crying. Webb gripped his spotlight so hard the plastic casing cracked. Thibodeau was praying in French, the words tumbling out in a desperate whisper. Then silence. The storm continued, but whatever had moved through their camp was gone. They could feel its absence the way you feel temperature change. Keller checked his equipment with shaking hands. Everything had recorded. The audio was clean, clear, undeniable. The video cameras, all 6 of them, showed nothing but corrupted files. Frame after frame of digital artifacts, pixelated nonsense, as if something about what they had recorded was incompatible with the compression algorithms. The thermal footage was worse, showing impossible heat signatures that formed patterns the analysis software couldn't process. They left at first light, moving faster than safety recommended. The journey out took 7 hours of sustained paddling and hiking. Nobody spoke beyond necessary communication. When they reached their vehicles, still parked where they had left them 4 days earlier, Keller loaded his equipment with mechanical precision, then quietly informed Chen that he was done. He would process the audio they had captured, would fulfill his contractual obligations to deliver the raw files, but he would not return to that swamp. He would not discuss what they had heard. His fee could be kept or donated, or burned for all he cared. He was finished with this kind of work. The corruption of the video footage remains unexplained. Multiple forensic digital analysts examined the files and found no evidence of typical corruption causes. The data suggested the cameras had functioned normally, that frames had been captured and written to storage, but something in the encoding process had failed in ways that violated the known parameters of the hardware. One analyst noted that the corruption patterns looked almost purposeful, as if something had selectively destroyed visual data while leaving audio untouched. That audio, processed and cleaned by Keller before he left the project, represents the most compelling acoustic evidence ever captured of an unidentified bipedal creature in North America. The footfall patterns, the breathing, the vocalization, all analyzed by independent experts who confirmed that the sounds could not be attributed to any known animal. The files were submitted to 3 major cryptozoology databases and 2 university research programs. And then something strange happened. The audio began appearing in other contexts. First on a meditation app, labeled as thunderstorm ambience, recorded in Louisiana wetlands. Then in a sleep sound compilation, mixed with rain and distant animal calls. The vocalization, that 12-second roar that had terrorized an experienced research team, was being sampled, stretched, filtered, and embedded in relaxation tracks. Music producers discovered the frequency patterns, created interesting harmonic foundations. Within 2 years, elements of the Honey Island audio had been incorporated into thousands of ambient soundtracks, rain sounds for sleeping, thunderstorm recordings for relaxation. The people who listen to these tracks, who play them on repeat through the night, who find them strangely soothing, despite never being able to explain why, have no idea what they are hearing. They do not know that the low rumble beneath the synthesized rain is something massive walking through dark water. They do not know that the deep resonance that seems to ease their anxiety is breathing, captured from something that science says should not exist. They do not know that the distant roar they find oddly comforting made a Navy SEAL afraid to turn on a light. Dr. Rick Chen attempted to trace the distribution of the audio, to understand how it had leaked from research databases into commercial use. But the trail dissolved into licensing agreements and sample libraries, sounds sold and resold until origin became meaningless. The original context was lost, buried under layers of commerce and remix culture. The truth became a rumor, became a forgotten footnote. The expedition footage, what little remained uncorrupted, sits in university archives. The audio files, the ones that matter, are everywhere and nowhere. They play in bedrooms and meditation studios, in therapy offices and yoga classes, a piece of something ancient and unknown woven so thoroughly into modern ambient culture that it has become invisible. Millions of people have heard the Honey Island vocalization. Almost none of them know it. The cameras started appearing along the edges of Honey Island swamp in the spring of 2021. Researchers from Tulane University and Louisiana State fastened motion-activated trail cameras to cypress trees and tupelo gums, part of a broad wildlife monitoring study tracking black bear populations and river otter movements through the wetlands. Within 6 months, something impossible became undeniable. The cameras were disappearing. Not failing. Not malfunctioning. Vanishing entirely, along with their mounting brackets, security cables, and in 3 cases, portions of the tree bark itself, as if something had methodically removed every trace of human presence. By the end of 2022, 17 cameras had gone missing from the swamp. The following year brought 11 more. Wildlife biologists compared notes with colleagues managing similar studies across North America, from the Okefenokee in Georgia to the Atchafalaya Basin just west of Honey Island. The pattern that emerged sent a cold understanding through the research community. No other location, no other wetland or forest or conservation area in the entire United States and Canada had experienced camera losses at even a fraction of this rate. Honey Island swamp was an anomaly. Something there understood the technology. Something recognized surveillance and responded with methodical intelligence. But before the cameras disappeared, some of them recorded footage that would never appear in any published study. The timestamp read 11:47 post-meridiem on October 16, 2022. Rain hammered the swamp in vertical sheets, the kind of downpour that turns the air itself into water. The camera, mounted 8 feet up a cypress tree roughly 2 miles from the West Pearl River, activated when its infrared sensor detected motion. For the first 90 seconds, the footage showed only rain and wind-tossed vegetation, branches thrashing in the storm's grip. Then something moved between two trees in the middle distance, perhaps 40 yards from the camera position. The figure was tall, too tall, moving with a fluid gait that seemed wrong for the terrain. The infrared rendered it in shades of gray and white against the darker background, making precise details impossible to distinguish. But the shape was unmistakably bipedal. It walked upright, arms swinging in rhythm with its stride, moving from left to right, across the frame with purpose, as if following a specific route through the flooded understory. Then it stopped. The timestamp continued its digital count. 11:49, 11:52, midnight, .e, 12:15, 12:23. For 47 minutes, the figure remained absolutely motionless between those two trees, standing in the pouring rain. Researchers who later analyzed the footage noted that its posture suggested attention, focus. The way the head was angled, the positioning of the shoulders, everything indicated that this thing was watching something. It was watching the camera. At 12:34 ante-meridium, it turned and walked back the way it had come, disappearing into the darkness beyond the infrared range. 3 days later, when researchers hiked in to collect the SD card, the camera was gone. Only 4 small holes in the cypress bark remained where the mounting screws had been. The university never released this footage publicly. Too many questions they couldn't answer. Too many implications they weren't prepared to explore. But word spread through the small communities surrounding Honey Island Swamp. And as it spread, people began connecting fragments of experience they'd kept private, afraid of ridicule or disbelief. A pattern emerged from these scattered testimonies, a pattern that suggested something had changed in the swamp's behavior in recent years. Something had become bolder. The reports were remarkably consistent, given that the witnesses had no contact with each other, lived in different towns, traveled different sections of the swamp. They all described the same phenomenon, the same specific detail that appeared in account after account with troubling uniformity. Amber eyes in the tree line during rainstorms. Sarah Chen, a biology graduate student conducting water quality sampling in June of 2021, reported seeing them first. She'd been working along a Bayou feeder creek when afternoon thunderheads rolled in fast, the way they do in Louisiana summer, turning noon into twilight. She pulled her equipment under a makeshift tarp shelter and waited for the worst of it to pass. That's when she noticed the glow in the vegetation roughly 50 feet away. 2 points of amber light, positioned at what she estimated was 7 feet off the ground, unmoving despite the wind thrashing the palmetto fronds around them. She told investigators later that they didn't look like animal eyeshine reflecting from her headlamp. They appeared to generate their own luminescence, a warm, honey-colored glow that pulsed faintly with an irregular rhythm, almost like breathing. She watched them for perhaps 3 minutes. They watched back. Then the rain intensified into a true deluge. Visibility dropped to nothing, and when it cleared enough to see again, the lights were gone. She filed a report with her faculty advisor, noting the observation in clinical language, suggesting bioluminescent fungi or possibly methane ignition from swamp gas. She didn't mention the profound unease she'd felt under that gaze, the certainty that something intelligent was measuring her, calculating. Marcus Washington saw them in September of 2022 while running trot lines near the Pearl River confluence. Late afternoon storm, the kind that builds slow and dark. He'd been checking his last line when the rain started, big drops that struck the water's surface like small caliber rounds. And there in the willow thicket on the eastern bank, 2 amber lights appeared at eye level, maybe his eye level if he stood up in the boat, watching him work. He called out, thinking maybe someone was playing games, shining a light. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink, just maintained that steady, unwavering attention. Marcus was a third-generation fisherman who'd spent 40 years working these waters. He knew every animal that lived in this swamp, knew their eyes, their habits, their territories. These eyes belonged to nothing he recognized. He started his outboard motor and left his trotlines unchecked. 3 days later, he returned with his adult son to retrieve the lines. They found them methodically destroyed, not tangled or torn by debris, but deliberately cut at regular intervals. The hooks removed and placed in a neat pile on a cypress knee at the water's edge. By late 2022, at least 14 people had reported amber eyes in the tree line during rainstorms. Different locations throughout the swamp, different times, different months. but always the same height, always the same color, always the same watching stillness, always during rain. Then came the disappearance of Gerald Hayes in March of 2023. Hayes was a 52-year-old fishing guide with an impeccable reputation for safety and professionalism. He knew Honey Island Swamp better than most people know their own neighborhoods. On March 11, he departed from a private launch near Pearl River for what should have been a routine solo scouting trip to mark good fishing spots for the approaching spring season. He told his wife he'd be back before dark, 6 hours maximum. He didn't return that night, or the next day. Search and rescue teams scoured his known routes, checked every slough and oxbow where he might have sheltered or encountered mechanical trouble. The Coast Guard brought in helicopters. Volunteers from 3 parishes joined the search. They found his boat on the 3rd day, tied neatly to a mangrove root system in a remote section of the swamp he rarely visited, equipment undisturbed, life jacket folded on the seat. Gerald Hayes was sitting in the boat. He was dehydrated, mildly hypothermic despite the warm March temperatures, and completely unresponsive to questions about where he'd been. Medical examination found no injuries, no signs of assault or substance use, no physiological explanation for his condition. He seemed to be in shock, but shock from what? No one could determine. It took 4 days before he began speaking in complete sentences. When he did, he had no memory of the 3-day period. Nothing. His last clear recollection was motoring into a narrow channel to check for fallen trees. After that, nothing but darkness, until he became aware of the search and rescue team surrounding his boat. Almost nothing. The nightmares started within a week of his return. His wife later told investigators that he would wake gasping, drenched in sweat, speaking fragments that never quite formed coherent narratives. But 2 words appeared in every episode, sometimes whispered, sometimes screamed. Rain and breathing. He would sit bolt upright in bed, eyes wide and unseeing, and say the rain was breathing, or it breathes with the rain, or simply breathing rain, over and over, until she could calm him back to full consciousness. After 6 weeks of this, after the nightmares cost him work and sleep and peace, Hayes agreed to try hypnotic regression therapy with a psychologist in Slidell. The sessions were recorded with his permission. Transcripts exist, though they've never been made public. According to the therapist's notes, Hayes described being led into the deep swamp by something he couldn't see clearly, something that moved just ahead of him in the rain, always partially obscured. He followed for what felt like hours, though he couldn't explain why he followed or what compelled him forward. He remembered amber light. He remembered standing water and the sound of breathing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, that matched the rhythm of rainfall on leaves, that made the rain itself feel alive and aware. He remembered being watched by something patient, something that had all the time in the world, something that wanted him to understand that he was permitted to leave only because it allowed him to leave. The therapist ended the sessions after Hayes became so distressed during the 4th regression that he had to be sedated. In her final notes, she wrote that she believed his subconscious was protecting him from memories too traumatic to consciously process, and that continued attempts to access them might cause permanent psychological damage. Gerald Hayes stopped guiding in Honey Island Swamp. He sold his boat in August of 2023 and now works at a hardware store in Slidell. He won't discuss what happened, won't even drive past the launch points where he used to put in. The university researchers noticed something else troubling in their remaining camera data. When they reviewed months of footage from cameras that hadn't been destroyed or stolen, they found recurring anomalies during rain events. Frames where the motion sensor activated but showed nothing unusual, except for the data itself. The camera's internal clocks would sometimes skip forward or backward by minutes during these activations, as if time itself became unstable. Temperature sensors would record impossible readings, dropping 30 degrees in seconds then recovering just as quickly. And in the audio, because some cameras included sound recording, there were sounds beneath the rain static that the researchers couldn't classify. Rhythmic sounds, almost like respiration, if respiration could be 8 feet across and slow as a heartbeat. By mid-2023, the research project was quietly terminated. Funding, they said publicly. Budget constraints. But 3 of the graduate students involved transferred to different programs at different universities. One left wildlife biology entirely. None would discuss their work in Honey Island Swamp on record. The cameras still disappear. Local hunters and fishermen find the mounting brackets sometimes, twisted and deformed, dropped in clearings or left on sandbars like warnings. As of late 2023, 31 cameras have vanished from the swamp. 31 sophisticated pieces of technology, eliminated with surgical precision. Something in Honey Island Swamp has learned to recognize surveillance. It knows the cameras, knows the researchers, knows when it's being observed. And it has decided that some observations will not be permitted, that some evidence will not be allowed to exist. The most chilling aspect isn't the destroyed cameras or the missing time, or even the amber eyes that appear with such disturbing consistency. It's the intelligence those actions reveal, the patience, the systematic elimination of threats, the apparent understanding of human technology and human intent. Apex predators don't hide from cameras. They don't need to. They don't possess the cognitive architecture to recognize surveillance as a concept requiring response. Whatever watches from Honey Island Swamp during rainstorms, whatever breathes around Gerald Hayes in the darkness, whatever dismantles research equipment with methodical precision, it isn't operating on predator instinct. It's thinking, planning, weighing, adapting to human presence with sophisticated awareness. And if it knows it's being watched, if it understands cameras and studies and research, then it must also understand something else. It must know that eventually, someone will come looking not with cameras, but with themselves. That eventually, curiosity will overcome caution. The question that haunts researchers who've worked in that swamp, the thought that wakes them at odd hours, is simple and terrifying. Is it waiting for that? Has it been waiting all along? And the rain begins to fall over Honey Island Swamp, and somewhere in that vast expanse of cypress and shadow, something stirs. We have traveled through decades of encounters, examined footprints that defy explanation, listened to voices trembling with fear as they recalled eyes watching from the darkness. But now we must confront what all this evidence reveals, and perhaps more unsettling, what it fails to explain. Why does the activity surge when water falls from the sky? Witnesses across 50 years report the same pattern. The creature emerges when rain touches the swamp, as if summoned by some meteorological trigger we cannot fathom. Scientists might speak of animal behavior and feeding patterns, but that explanation dissolves when faced with tracks that appear in mud during downpours and vanish before morning, as though whatever made them exists only in those wet, liminal hours between storms. And what of those 4 toes? Every plaster cast, every photograph, every description etched in memory speaks of that impossible configuration. Not 3, not 5, but 4 distinct impressions pressed deep into Louisiana soil. Creatures evolve within understood parameters, yet these prints suggest something outside our biological framework, something that walks through our world but may not entirely belong to it. The audio recordings present perhaps the most disturbing mystery. Researchers have captured sounds from the swamp depths, frequencies that oscillate at the edge of human perception. People who listen report dreams that night, vivid and strange, filled with watching eyes and ancient water. Coincidence, they tell themselves upon waking. Yet it happens again and again, a phenomenon documented but unexplained. Right now, across the world, millions of people drift towards sleep accompanied by ambient sound. Rainfall, distant thunder, the nocturnal chorus of wetlands. Among those carefully curated soundscapes, recordings from Honey Island Swamp have found particular popularity. Something about that specific acoustic signature soothes the conscious mind, even as it whispers to something deeper. We stream these sounds through our speakers and headphones, inviting the swamp into our most vulnerable hours, never questioning what might be woven into those frequencies, what might be listening from the other end. Perhaps the Honey Island Swamp monster has never been hiding at all. Perhaps it exists in spaces we cannot fully perceive, in the gaps between raindrops, in sound waves that bypass our understanding and speak directly to the ancient parts of our brain that remember when humans were prey. The swamp remains unconquered, a place where nature still holds dominion, where our phones lose signal and our certainty dissolves into mist. Something walks there, in that threshold place where water meets land, where known animals end and questions begin. It watches from eyes we feel but cannot see. It moves through a world that overlaps our own, but operates on rules we have not yet discovered. The evidence remains. The questions endure. And the rain continues to fall. Tonight, when you close your eyes to the sound of rain, remember, somewhere in the darkness, something else is listening too. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.